Rush, earlier this morning on our show, we talked to Richard Fontaine, whom you know, of course, from your time at at CNAS, right? And, his thinking is in terms of the Asia pivot, there have been fits and starts, and a lot of, administrations have not carried through with the Asia pivot. If come November, the Democrats prevail, and it's Harris and it's Tim Walz, interestingly, right? Are you confident that the pivot will reorient itself to Asia and especially China?
Well, again, let's look at the track record, because I think that's some of the best data we have to get a sense of what's going to come in the period ahead. The track record is that the Biden-Harris administration has spent 4 years deeply involved in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps the most robust Indo-Pacific agenda of any administration, really in decades. And you look at the track record of successes, and they're enormous. There's AUKUS, the Quad at the leader level, trilateral to Japan and Korea, trilateral to Japan and the Philippines. You look at the economic and technology agenda involving allies and partners, record allied and partner investment in the U.S., coordination on export controls and other action. It's a pretty stunning agenda. And it's the kind of agenda, to be totally frank, that wasn't possible in the prior administration because the Trump administration was picking fights with allies rather than working together with allies to deal with the challenge, of China and other challenges around the region. And I think what's critical, again, is that Vice President Harris was deeply involved in all of that work. Not only, as I mentioned, did she meet with just about every Indo-Pacific leader from the very first year of the Biden-Harris administration, but she also spent time going to the region, multiple trips, sometimes more than one trip to Asia in just the same year, and actually had results. I mean, she was also, just take one example that I gave you, the U.S. Japan Philippines trilateral in 2024 between the leaders. That was a big deal. But in 2023, Vice President Harris convened that same meeting and actually set the stage for a sort of more consequential leader level meeting the following year. So she's been deeply involved in all of this, has knowledge of it. Again, I don't speak for the campaign, but I think anybody who looks at the track record of the previous 3 or 4 years can see very clearly this is an administration that's deeply involved in the region.
Yes. Rush, what happens to the U.S. Taiwan policy? Does it remain strategically ambiguous? Does it remain deliberately vague? Or if Trump has his way, and if he is elected, then is there going to be effectively a hands-off approach when it comes to Taiwan? And how vulnerable does that leave Taiwan, considering that the Chinese leadership still seem to be committed to this target year of 2027?
Yeah, you've raised a really important question, which I think is really open. There's a increasingly bipartisan consensus on elements of China policy. But what is striking to me is that in many ways, President Trump exists sort of outside that bipartisan consensus. So this isn't even necessarily a partisan issue. I think members of his party would prefer to him to make sort of more resolute statements about Taiwan. But instead, a few weeks ago, to Bloomberg Business Week, he suggested that Taiwan was essentially indefensible and that the United States should be paid to defend Taiwan. Those are pretty remarkable statements. And for any kind of policy of ambiguity to be successful, that kind of clarity about the fact that you have skepticism of the defense commitment is deeply dangerous. And I do wonder, or rather I worry about statements like that emboldening the PRC to take action in the Taiwan Strait. Maybe even the kinds of action they may not be considering now because there's a leader or potential leader out there saying, well, it's not really the American problem in the first place. More broadly, I think this just kind of underscores some of the challenges that we're going to face if there is a second Trump administration, not only on the Taiwan side, but so much of what we were just talking about is the U.S. working with its allies and partners in the region on a variety of issues. And I think that is going to be very challenging in a potential Trump administration if you increase tariffs on all those allies.
Rush, realistically, can any administration pursue an active and a vigorous Asia pivot when there are so many foreign policy challenges globally that are contending for their attention and their participation, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, and whether it's the very fluid and potentially destabilizing situation in the Middle East?
It's a great question. And there's no doubt that many in Asia, I think, are concerned that maybe this might mean less time and attention, or has meant less time and attention for the region. But if you look at the track record again, even as the U.S. was involved in supporting Ukraine, and even after the outbreak of conflict in the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, there's still been sustained attention on Asia. And that's not accidental. This is a group of people who, frankly, are committed to the idea of being engaged in what they see as maybe the most consequential theater of the future. People who were there a decade ago and saw that, there was some risk of distraction as ISIS was sweeping across Iraq and as Russia was seizing Crimea. So this is not a rerun of that last decade. People have learned, I think, from the challenges of that period, and they've been recommitted to the region. And I would say, on top of that, what's interesting about things this time around is that in many ways, the story of U.S. policy in Asia isn't just the U.S. being engaged in Asia. It's being engaged in Asia with Europeans. And conversely, Asian countries being involved in affairs in Europe, too. That has been really interesting, this kind of knitting together of American alliances in Europe and American alliances in Asia across a wide variety of challenges. That is something we didn't see 10 years ago. And that's a fundamental change in the kind of allied and partner diplomacy that I think President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration were uniquely able to accomplish.